Adam Taxin here with Rabbi Nochum Kurinsky in Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida. He runs Chabad The Beaches, which you can find online at chabadbeaches.com. We're talking about Parsha Beshalach, which we've talked about in another video, but a different topic here. That is, by the way, Exodus chapter 17, verse 13 through, I believe it's chapter 16, verse 17. And there's something interesting here, which is sometimes overlooked, about the four groups the Jews split in before they crossed the Sea of Reeds. And there's some lessons there, so why don't you tell us about it?
Okay, thank you, Adam. So there's a very, very beautiful verse. So Moses tells the Jewish people, and I'll read it in Hebrew and in English. Moses said to the nation, Al tiro, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, stand firm and see God's salvation. He will do today. You see Egypt today, but never see them again. And the rabbis tell us that Moses was actually telling the Jewish people several things. And the reason is that the Jewish people left Egypt. You can imagine they were in a terrible predicament. They left Egypt. They had the Egyptians hot on their heels. They had just been slaves. They were terrified of the Egyptians. In front of them was the Sea of Reeds, right? Not the Red Sea. That was a mistake in the map making. And there was literally nowhere to go. So some of the Jewish people panicked and they said, "Look, it's better to go back to Egypt. Better to be slaves. Better to be slaves to Pharaoh. At least they're free. At least we live." You know, it's similar to some of the Jews that I had the privilege to meet after communism. You know, some of them, the first few years after communism, some of these communist countries in the Soviet Union and parts of Germany, and it took time to get established, and some of them wanted to go back to communism, not because they liked it, because at least they felt secure. They had something. There was, and we had to encourage them and say, look, if you hold on a little bit, you get. You hold strong, stand strong.
And the difference is, you're talking a couple of years after communism. This was a couple of days.
This is a couple of hours. Right? It's only 3 days, right? Yeah. And Egypt was hot on the hills. So you can imagine that they felt, look, they wanted freedom, but they were terrified of it.
Right.
Freedom comes at a price. And then there was Jewish people that said, look, we're never going back to Egypt. Come hell or high water, we're not going back to Egypt. We're going to go. We'd rather drown. Right? And then there were people who said, look, we're Jews. When we're in a difficult predicament, what do? We'll pray. We'll stop and we'll pray. We'll ask God for salvation. He can help us. And then there was a group that said, let's declare war against the Egyptians. Yes, we're a small number. We're not well trained. They're well trained, but at least we'll go down. We'll have a fighting chance. We'll go down with a fight. And historically, what's very fascinating about this is these four groups. Each one represents a different era in history, and all four of these groups, there was a time when each one of them was correct about a solution. You're facing a difficult predicament. For example, the Medrash tells us that there was actually a tribe that escaped Egypt during the Egyptian slavery. And they were told not to because they weren't capable of being free yet. And they were told to go back and they all died in the desert.
That's right.
Right? Some people say that's tribe.
This was
Tribe Yisachar, I believe.
Yisachar.
And I believe that's the valley. Some people say that's the valley of the bones that Elijah resurrected. That's the resurrection, the valley of the bones. The song "Dry Bones." That was the valley of the dry. So there was a time when it's not appropriate to leave, but then of course there's a time like you had. So there's time to go back to Egypt, and then there's a time when a person faces a predicament like the Jewish people. It's controversial, but the people on Masada, there was a group in the Soviet Union in White Russia, let's say Ukraine, an entire group of Jewish children, 600 Jewish children that committed suicide rather than being forcibly baptized, and so they went into the Dnieper River and they never came out. Again, they would rather give their life than be forced to turn against their faith. So there's a time that that calls for suicide. Of course, there's the famous Masada, which is controversial whether they did the right thing or not. But still, you see the Jews committing suicide instead of giving up, instead of giving it to their enemy. Then there's a time to declare war. You have a time like the Maccabees, famously, a small group, right? Few in the hands of many. The whole miracle of Hanukkah is a miracle of a small group of rabbis, untrained rabbis, that defeated the world superpower. And just simply to rededicate their temple, right? And then you have a time to pray. Often, that's often the case. That when someone's in a difficult situation, turn to God, ask Hashem, ask God Almighty, can you help me? And it's actually a biblical commandment for one to ask God for their needs. Very often people say to me, or they say to Rabbi, they say, well, it's not fair for me to ask God to be selfish and ask God for my needs. And actually, the response is, it may or may not be the case, logically speaking, but it's a biblical commandment. God Almighty Himself says that when you're in a difficult situation, you should ask me and should pray to me. And but praying to God is an act of faith. It's asking God for our needs. So the Jewish people had these 4 different paths, and all 4 of them were logical, and all 4 of them had historical or would have historical precedent at some point. The question is, what do they do? What do you do? And the answer was a man named Nachshon ben Aminadav, who was the head of a tribe, but also Aaron's brother-in-law, who said, it's very simple. Moses told us that God told him by Yisrael to move forward. So he started walking into the sea, not walking into the sea to commit suicide, but walking into the sea because Moses said to go, so he went. He had faith, and that's one of the principles of Judaism. It says right before the song that we sing, Al Yashir, the song that we thank God for splitting the sea. It says the Jewish people, Yaminu v'Hashem over Moshe Avda. They had faith in God, but they also had faith in Moses. And that's a principle in Judaism, having faith in Moses, having faith in the great rabbis, the great leaders of the generation. Sometimes we don't know what to do. We have very, very you're facing a predicament in life where there are several logical alternatives. There's several paths to choose that all make sense. The question is what to do, and that's why God blesses us that every generation has its leaders and has the leaders of the generation that are there just to tell us what are our generation's needs. What direction do we do? What is the unique personality of our generation? In our generation, of course, we had one of the greatest leaders of our generation was the Lubavitcher Rabbi, whose anniversary of his assuming leadership is this Shabbat, is Yud Shvat, is this week. And one of the things that he spoke about was that in our generation, it's our time to action is the main thing in our generation. Our generation, we have to go out and each one of us has to try to inspire someone else. Men go find another Jewish man to put tefillin on him. Women find a Jewish woman to light Shabbat candles. With non-Jews to be inspired. There's inspiration for you too in the Bible. The 7 Noahide laws. It's a time for action. It's time for us to increase light and goodness in the world. It's time for us to just focus on specific commandments, on doing good deeds, not so much on the thought behind it, but just action is the main thing. That's our generation. So when we're faced with our personal dilemmas, we turn to our Moses and our generation, and we say, what are our generational needs? And it's laid out clearly for us. That's the message from this parsha.
Great, thank you. Let's just summarize that once more. The 4 different things we could do are, once more,
suicide, war, pray,
take action,
or go back to Egypt.
Go back to Egypt.
Give in.
Well, what about taking action? Where does that fit in?
That was war.
Oh, that's war. Well, Nachshon, but what ultimately?
Nachshon was a different kind of action. It was a higher level of action. It wasn't declaring war. It was simply doing something that didn't make any sense to him, but doing what Moses said. It was a different type of action. It wasn't an action that was logical, reasonable. It was an action that Moses had told him to do, as opposed to declaring war, which makes a lot of sense.
So it's suicide versus war versus prayer versus enslavement, self-enslavement.
Going back, giving up.
All right. Thank you, as always.